September 15th, 1916. Dawn over the Somme battlefield was not a gentle arrival of light, but a slow, grey delusion of a darkness, already filled with the thunder of artillery and the chattering of distant machine guns. For Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt of the 183 Infantry Regiment, peering over the parapet of his trench near the village of Flares, it was a morning like any other in this endless, senseless war. The landscape before him was a mangled ruin of what had once been French farmland, a churned-up sea of mud, shell craters, and skeletal remains of trees. 2 years of war had taught him that nothing new ever happened here. There was only the shelling, the waiting, and the inevitable, suicidal order to go over the top. But on this morning, something new did happen. Through the drifting smoke and the morning mist, Karl saw something impossible. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. It was a shape, a monstrous geometric shadow, lurching forward from the British lines. It was huge, grey and metallic, crawling over the cratered earth with an unnatural, grinding motion. It wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. It moved with a terrifying, inhuman purpose, impervious to the rifle and machine gun fire that began to spark harmlessly off its iron hide. As it drew closer, he could see it crushing the thickets of barbed wire, the very obstacle that had killed thousands of his comrades, as if they were dry twigs. Then, from sponsons on its sides, its own machine guns opened up, spraying his trench line with a torrent of lead. Panic, a cold, primal fear of the unknown, gripped Karl's heart. What was this thing, this iron beast, this Landship? What Karl Schmidt and thousands of German soldiers were witnessing on that September morning was the birth of a new god of war. It was the public debut of a weapon so revolutionary, so secret, that its own creators had disguised it under the codename Tank. The German High Command, who had received early intelligence reports of British armoured tractors and filed them away with skeptical dismissal, some officers reportedly scoffing at what they considered British fantasy, were about to receive a brutal, mechanical lesson in the price of complacency. This is the story of how the most stagnant, bloody deadlock in military history gave birth to one of its most dynamic inventions. It's the story of a handful of visionaries who fought their own stubborn generals to bring a bizarre idea to life, and how that idea, in the form of a clumsy, unreliable, but terrifyingly effective machine, crushed not only barbed wire and trenches, but also the German certainty that their defensive lines could never be broken. To understand the sheer, earth-shattering impact of the tank's arrival, one must first understand the hell it was designed to conquer. The year 1916 was the bloody centerpiece of the First World War. The initial, fluid campaigns of 1914 were a distant memory. The Western Front had hardened into a 400-mile-long, unbroken line of complex trench systems stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. It was a scar on the face of Europe, a testament to a new and horrifying form of industrial warfare. The power of the defense had become absolute. 3 elements, working in a deadly trinity, had created this stalemate. First was the barbed wire, strung in thick, dense belts in the area between the trenches known as no man's land. It was designed to trap and slow down attacking infantry. Second was the machine gun, the German Maxim MG-08, a water-cooled, belt-fed weapon, could fire 500 rounds per minute. A handful of well-placed machine guns could annihilate an entire battalion of men caught in the wire. Third was the artillery. Massive batteries of guns, miles behind the lines, could rain down a continuous storm of high-explosive and shrapnel shells, turning no man's land into a pre-ploughed graveyard and obliterating any attack before it even reached the enemy's wire. The result of this trinity was slaughter on a scale the world had never seen. Generals on both sides, men who had learned warfare on horseback, continued to believe that the key to victory was a massive infantry assault. The Times World. Big Push. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, was the ultimate, horrific proof of their folly. After a week-long artillery bombardment that was supposed to destroy the German defenses, 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and walked towards the German lines. The German machine gunners, who had weathered the storm in deep concrete dugouts, simply emerged, set up their guns, and began to fire. The British Army suffered 57,000 470 casualties, including 19,240 killed on that single morning. It was the bloodiest day in the history of British warfare. This was the problem. This was the unbreakable deadlock. The German High Command, under commanders like Erich von Falkenhayn, had absolute faith in their defensive systems. They had scientifically perfected trench warfare. They believed, with good reason, that no amount of infantry, no matter how brave, could break their lines. Their entire strategy was based on Materialschlacht, a battle of material, designed to bleed the Allied armies dry in a war of attrition. The idea of a land-based armored vehicle was not something they seriously considered. It was the stuff of H.G. Wells' novels, a fantasy that had no place in the practical, grim business of modern war. But across the Channel, in Great Britain, there were a few men who refused to accept this bloody status quo. They understood that sending more men to their deaths was not a strategy. It was madness. They realized that if flesh and blood could not defeat the machine gun, then perhaps a new machine was needed. The idea was championed by a small, determined group of officers and engineers, with support from multiple quarters of the British military establishment. But one of its most powerful and energetic political backers was a man who was, at the time, a controversial figure in the British government, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Churchill, a man of boundless imagination and energy, saw the potential of using caterpillar track tractors, like those being produced in America, as a basis for an armored landship. He envisioned a vehicle that could cross the trenches, crush the wire, and protect its crew from machine gun fire, allowing it to deliver its own firepower directly into the enemy's trench. He used his position at the head of the Navy to form the Landships Committee, bringing together military officers and civilian engineers, and provided crucial funding with naval research money, helping to bypass some of the skepticism in the army leadership. Churchill was not alone in his vision. Officers like Colonel Ernest Swinton were equally instrumental, but his political weight and determination were crucial in keeping the project alive during its vulnerable early stages. The technical challenges were immense. The project was handed to two brilliant engineers, William Tritton and Major Walter Wilson. Working in a secret workshop in Lincoln, they began designing a machine the likes of which had never been built. Their first prototype, Little Willie, was a start, but it couldn't cross the wide German trenches. Their second design, the one that would become the blueprint for all future tanks, was codenamed Nether. It had the iconic rhomboidal shape, with tracks that ran all the way around the hull, allowing it to climb obstacles and cross trenches. The entire project was shrouded in the deepest secrecy. The workers in the factory were told they were building mobile water carriers for the campaign in Mesopotamia. To reinforce this cover story, the finished vehicles were crated up and marked with the words, "With care to Petrograd," and, more importantly, stenciled with the label, "Water Carrier." The factory workers began referring to the strange machines by the shortened version of this label. They called them tanks. The name, born of a need for secrecy, stuck. By the summer of 1916, after months of frantic design and testing, Mother had given birth to her first offspring, the Mark I tank. There were two versions, a male armed with two naval 6-pounder cannons and 3 machine guns, and a female armed with 5 machine guns. They were monstrous creations, 28 tons of steel, powered by a 105-horsepower engine, with a top speed of just 3.7 miles per hour. They were hot, incredibly noisy, and filled with noxious fumes. The 8-man crew communicated with hand signals over the deafening roar of the engine, but they were bulletproof, and they could cross a 9-foot trench. Despite a successful demonstration for the military leadership, many in the British High Command, including the Commander-in-Chief, General Douglas Haig, remained deeply skeptical. They saw the tanks as a novelty, an auxiliary weapon, at best. Against the advice of the tank's creators, who begged for more time to build hundreds of tanks and train the crews for a massive, decisive assault, Haig ordered the new machines to be sent to the Somme front in September. He intended to use them not for a war-winning breakthrough, but to simply assist in one more big push. 49 tanks were allocated to the offensive, a number that would prove both too small to be decisive and too large to keep entirely secret. And so, in the late summer of 1916, these secret weapons, these untested landships, were loaded onto trains under heavy canvas sheets, bound for the meat grinder of the Somme. They were a desperate gamble, born of visionary thinking and political willpower, about to be thrown into battle by generals who barely understood them. The German army, secure in their trenches, had received fragmentary intelligence reports about unusual British vehicles, but these had been largely dismissed by staff officers as exaggerated or unreliable. The systematic underestimation of this new threat would soon exact a terrible price. The night before the attack was a special kind of hell for the men of the newly formed Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps. These were the world's first tank crews. Cuddled inside their 28-ton steel tombs, they were not filled with the bravado of a new cavalry. They were exhausted, nauseous, and terrified. The Mark I tank was a primitive, brutal machine. The 105-horsepower engine, located inside the main crew compartment without any partition, roared with a deafening, skull-shattering noise that made communication by shouting impossible. It filled the cramped space with a toxic fog of carbon monoxide, cordite fumes, and scorching heat that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Many crewmen were violently ill before the battle even began. They were undertrained, having had only a few weeks to master these complex and temperamental machines. Of the 49 tanks that had been assigned to the offensive, mechanical breakdowns had already begun to take their toll during the approach march. By the morning of September 15th, only 36 had managed to reach their assembly positions behind the front lines. Even this reduced number represented a logistical miracle, given the primitive state of the machines and the churned-up state of the battlefield. But the attrition was not over. As 0 hour approached, engine failures, thrown tracks, and navigation difficulties in the pre-dawn darkness reduced the number of tanks that would actually participate in the attack to just 32. It was an inauspicious start for a revolution in warfare, a clear demonstration that the mechanical reliability of these experimental machines was perhaps their greatest weakness. As 0 hour approached, the British infantry waiting in their trenches looked upon the strange, rhomboidal beasts with a mixture of awe and skepticism. Then, at 6:20 a.m., the whistles blew. Along a 10-mile front, the British assault began, and with it, the tanks lurched forward, their steel tracks biting into the churned earth, crawling out of the British lines and into the hellscape of no man's land at a walking pace. For Carl Schmidt and the other German soldiers of the 28th Reserve Division, the morning began as a familiar nightmare. The British artillery had been pounding their lines for days. They huddled in their deep dugouts, waiting for the shelling to lift, the signal for the inevitable infantry assault. When it did, they scrambled to their machine gun posts, ready to once again perform the grim, mechanical task of mowing down waves of enemy soldiers. But as the smoke cleared, they saw something that did not belong in any soldier's manual, in any nightmare. They saw the Landships. The psychological impact was instantaneous and overwhelming. Reports from German frontline units that day are filled with words like Monster, Iron Dragon, Devil's Chariot. Their rifles were useless. Their machine guns, the undisputed kings of the battlefield, fired streams of bullets that sparked, ricocheted, and flattened against the fixed steel hides of the advancing machines without any effect. For soldiers who had come to believe in the absolute power of the MG-08, this was a terrifying, faith-shattering revelation. Panic began to ripple through the German trenches. Men who had bravely faced down artillery and massed infantry assaults broke and ran. They were not fleeing from soldiers, they were fleeing from an unnatural, unstoppable apparition. Carl Schmidt, watching the iron beast crush his section of wire and grind inexorably toward his position, felt his hands trembling on his rifle. He had survived 2 years of this war by following orders and keeping his head down. But no order, no amount of discipline had prepared him for this. When the monster's machine guns began raking his trench and the man next to him fell with a scream, Carl made a decision that would have been unthinkable an hour before. He ran. One of the most spectacular successes occurred at the village of Flers. A Mark I tank, number D-17, commanded by Captain Hastings, advanced far ahead of the infantry. It approached a heavily fortified German strongpoint, the Body in One sugar factory, and systematically destroyed its machine gun nests with its 6-pounder cannons. It then continued its relentless advance, crawling over German trenches, its machine guns spraying death into the terrified defenders. It reached the outskirts of Flers and, without waiting for the infantry, simply turned down the main road and lumbered into the center of the village. A British pilot flying overhead spotted the unbelievable sight and radioed back one of the most famous messages of the war. A tank is walking up the high street of Flers, with the British army cheering behind. The capture of Flers was a moment of pure cinematic triumph. An objective that would have cost thousands of lives in a conventional infantry assault had been spearheaded by a single 28-ton machine. Elsewhere on the battlefield, similar, if less dramatic successes were unfolding. Near the village of Martin-Puich, several tanks worked in concert with the infantry. They would identify a German machine gun nest, crawl directly towards it, and either destroy it with cannon fire or simply drive over it, crushing the gun and its crew under its immense weight. They flattened swathes of barbed wire, creating clear lanes for the infantry to advance through. For the first time in 2 years, the seemingly unbreakable German front line was being decisively ruptured. The British infantry, who had come to see no man's land as a certain grave, now followed in the tracks of these iron behemoths with a renewed, almost euphoric sense of hope. But for every story of triumph, there was a story of frustrating failure. The Mark I tank was a deeply flawed, mechanically fragile weapon being pushed to its absolute limit. Of the 32 tanks that started the attack, only 21 made it across no man's land to engage the German lines. The remaining 11 either broke down, engines seizing, transmissions failing, fuel systems rupturing, or became ditched, stuck in the massive shell craters or trenches that littered the landscape. One tank was knocked out by a lucky artillery shell before it even reached the German wire. Another, having successfully crossed the German lines, was accidentally set on fire by its own crew when spilled petrol ignited from the engine heat. The crews who survived often emerged from their machines barely conscious, poisoned by fumes and heat exhaustion. The German army, though initially panicked, began to adapt with terrifying speed. Artillery observers, realizing that machine guns were useless, began to direct their batteries onto the slow-moving tanks. The German field guns, firing high-explosive shells at close range, could crack the tank's armor or, with a direct hit, destroy it completely. German infantrymen, recovering from their initial shock, discovered that while rifle bullets were useless, a well-thrown potato masher grenade into the tank's tracks could cripple it. They also found that by concentrating their machine gun fire on the tiny vision slits, they could create a hail of lead splinters inside the tank, wounding or blinding the crew. The iron monsters were not invincible after all. Carl Schmidt, having recovered his nerve in a reserve trench, watched as a tank that had terrorized his company earlier in the day ground to a halt, one of its tracks blown off by a grenade. The crew, trying to escape through the hatches, were cut down by rifle fire. The monster could be killed. By the end of the day, the results were a confusing mix of spectacular success and dismal failure. The British had advanced, in some places up to 2 miles, a massive gain by the brutal standards of the Somme. They had captured key objectives like Flers and Martin-Puich with far fewer casualties than expected. But the grand, strategic breakthrough that General Haig had dreamed of had not materialized. Of the original 49 tanks allocated to the operation, barely a handful was still operational by nightfall. The mechanical failure rate had been catastrophic. The revolution had begun, but it had sputtered, its full potential only glimpsed. However, the most significant impact of the day was not on the map, but in the minds of the German High Command. The reports flooding into General Headquarters were alarming. Frontline commanders were describing a new British weapon that was immune to machine gun fire and could cross any trench. While there was no official laughter recorded in the minutes of staff meetings, the contrast between the earlier dismissive attitude toward intelligence reports of British experiments and the sudden, urgent concern now gripping headquarters was stark and telling. The earlier confidence, the belief that such weapons were impractical fantasies, had evaporated in a single morning. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, one of the most senior German commanders on the Western Front, wrote in his diary that evening that the new British weapon was causing great anxiety. General Ludendorff, the true architect of the German war effort, immediately ordered the formation of a special commission to study the new threat and devise countermeasures. The age of German confidence in their impenetrable trench systems was over. In a single day, a few dozen clumsy machines had introduced a terrifying new variable into the equation of war. The Germans immediately began developing armor-piercing ammunition, the the K-bullet, and started training their artillerymen in the new signs of anti-tank gunnery. On the British side, the reaction was equally decisive. General Haig, the skeptic, was converted. Despite the breakdowns and the limited success, he had seen enough. He had witnessed a weapon that could break the deadlock. That evening, he sent a request back to London. He didn't ask for a few more tanks. He ordered 1,000 of them. The gamble, flawed as its execution had been, had paid off. The secret weapon was secret no more, and the race was on. The Germans would now race to find a way to kill the tank, while the British and French would race to perfect it. The debut of the tank on September 15th, 1916, was not the war-winning moment its creators had hoped for. It was a clumsy, messy, and deeply imperfect beginning. But it was a beginning. It was a mechanical scream of defiance against the tyranny of the machine gun and the barbed wire. It was proof that the bloody stalemate of the trenches was not a permanent condition, but a problem that could be solved with ingenuity and steel. The earlier dismissiveness of the German generals had been replaced by urgent action, the stark admission that their defensive doctrine had been fundamentally challenged. The age of armor had arrived. The aftermath of the Somme offensive plunged the Western Front into the bitter winter of 1916 to 1917, a period of grim reflection and frantic innovation. For the British, the tank's debut had been a tantalizing glimpse of a possible future, a flawed but powerful proof of concept. For the Germans, it was a terrifying wake-up call, a mechanical demon that had to be exercised. The earlier complacency had been replaced by the cold, methodical work of finding a counter-weapon. The race was on. On the German side, the response was twofold. First came the immediate tactical solutions. German engineers worked with furious speed to develop the Spitzgeschoss McKern, or K-bullet, a steel-cored armor-piercing round for their standard rifles and machine guns. While only effective against the thin armor of the Mark I tank at very close ranges, it gave the common infantryman a fighting chance, a psychological boost against the iron monsters. More effectively, artillery tactics were written. Field gunners were trained to engage tanks with direct fire, a practice that would become the foundation of anti-tank warfare for the next century. German soldiers were taught to stay calm, to let the clumsy machines pass through their front lines, and then to attack their vulnerable sides and rear with grenades and concentrated fire. The British and French, meanwhile, were in a race to improve their new weapon. The Mark I, for all its psychological impact, was a mechanical nightmare. Its designers, William Tritton and Walter Wilson, immediately began work on a successor. The result, which would enter service in 1917, was the Mark IV tank. It was not a radical redesign, but a significant improvement. Its armor was slightly thicker. The dangerous internal fuel tanks were moved to an external, armored container at the rear, reducing the catastrophic risk of fire. Most importantly, its mechanical components were strengthened, making it marginally more reliable. At the same time, the British Tank Corps was expanded, with a focus on better training and developing new tactics for cooperation with infantry and artillery. The bloody offensives of 1917 became the brutal testing ground for these evolving machines and tactics. At the Battle of Arras, and, most infamously, at the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, hundreds of Mark IV tanks were thrown into the fight, but the results were often disastrous. The generals, still learning how to use their new weapon, often deployed them on ground that had been churned into an impassable liquid hell by weeks of preliminary artillery bombardment. The fields of Flanders became a graveyard of steel. Tanks, weighing nearly 30 tons, bellied out on the lips of shell craters or sank into the swamp-like mud, becoming immobile, easy targets for German artillery. For every tank that successfully supported an infantry assault, another was lost to the mud. The tank was not yet the war-winning weapon it was hoped to be, but a true revolution in tank design was unfolding in France. The French, who had developed their own clumsy early tanks, like the Schneider CA1, unveiled a machine that would define the future. The Renault FT. It was small, light, and operated by a crew of just 2, but its design was a work of genius. It was the first tank to feature the now classic configuration: engine in the back, driver in the front, and a weapon mounted in a fully rotating turret on top. This single innovation, the rotating turret, meant the tank no longer had to turn its entire clumsy body to aim its gun. It could keep moving in one direction while engaging targets in another. The Renault FT was the true ancestor of every modern tank, from the T-34 to the M1 Abrams. As 1917 drew to a close, the British Tank Corps planned its most audacious operation yet, an attack that would finally use the tank as it was intended to be used. The target was the French town of Cambrai. The German defenses here were part of the formidable, deeply fortified Hindenburg Line. The ground was firm, rolling chalkland, perfect for tanks. The architect of the plan, Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, proposed a radical new doctrine. There would be no week-long preliminary artillery bombardment to warn the enemy and chew up the ground. Instead, the attack would rely on complete surprise. A massive, concentrated force of over 470 tanks, advancing in a dense wave, would be the dust. Artillery. They would crush the German barbed wire, cross the trenches, and smash through the Hindenburg Line, creating a breakthrough for the infantry and cavalry to exploit. On the morning of November 20th, 1917, the plan was put into action. At dawn, without a single warning shell, the earth began to tremble. The German defenders peered out from their bunkers and saw a horrifying spectacle. A vast fleet of Mark IV tanks, hundreds of them, was advancing upon them in a coordinated wave, emerging from the morning mist like a steel tide. The psychological shock was even greater than at the Somme. This was not a handful of experimental machines. This was an armored army. The effect was devastating. The tanks, many equipped with massive grappling hooks called fasces, to drop into trenches, crossed the supposedly impassable Hindenburg Line with ease. They flattened the dense forests of barbed wire. Their cannons and machine guns systematically silenced the German strongpoints. In just 6 hours, the British tanks and infantry achieved a breakthrough on a 6-mile front, advancing nearly 5 miles, a distance that had previously cost months of fighting and hundreds of thousands of casualties. The success was so stunning, so complete, that for the first time in the war, the church bells of London were rung in celebration of a victory. The tank had finally had its day. But the triumph of Cambrai was short-lived and incomplete. The British High Command was, once again, unprepared for the scale of its own success. The cavalry and infantry reserves were too far back and too slow to move into the gap the tanks had created. The tank crews, exhausted, and their machines low on fuel and ammunition after their deep advance, were left isolated and vulnerable. The strategic breakthrough, the war-winning moment, slipped through their fingers. The German army, though initially shattered, responded with characteristic speed and brilliance. 10 days later, they launched a massive counterattack. Bypassing the conventional artillery barrage, they used new, terrifyingly effective tactics. Small, elite squads, stormtroopers, armed with light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers, infiltrated the British lines under the cover of a short, ferociously intense artillery bombardment. They targeted weak points, bypassed strong points, and caused chaos in the British rear. The German counterattack was as revolutionary for infantry tactics as Cambrai had been for armored warfare. In a matter of days, they had pushed the British back, retaking almost all of the ground that had been so spectacularly won by the tanks. The Battle of Cambrai ended as a strategic stalemate, but its lessons were profound. For the Allies, it was definitive proof that a massed tank assault could break any trench system. The problem was no longer the tank itself, but the doctrine for its use. The future of warfare lay in combining the tank's breakthrough power with the speed of infantry and the support of aircraft, the birth of combined arms warfare. For the Germans, Cambrai was a final, terrifying warning. The K-bullet was not enough. They needed their own tanks. The shock of Cambrai spurred the German High Command to rush their own armored fighting vehicle, the monstrous A7V Sturmpanzerwagen, into production. As 1917 ended, the arms race had entered its final, frantic phase. The British were ordering thousands of new, improved Mark V tanks. The French were mass-producing their revolutionary Renault FT, and the Germans were desperately trying to catch up. The stage was set for 1918, the final year of the war, where these competing steel giants would finally meet on the battlefield in the world's first tank versus tank battles. The earlier skepticism of the generals was a distant, foolish memory. Now, there was only the sound of factories and a grim race to build a better monster. The year 1918 dawned with a strange and desperate hope for Germany. The Bolshevik Revolution had knocked Russia out of the war, freeing up nearly 1 million German soldiers from the Eastern Front to be transferred west. For the German High Command, under the iron will of General Ludendorff, this was their last window of opportunity. They had to achieve a decisive victory on the Western Front before the industrial and military might of the United States, now entering the war in force, could be fully brought to bear. This decision, in the United States, is always the same. It is a matter of the common capital.
This led to Operation Michael, the Great German Spring Offensive of 1918, a cataclysmic, last-ditch effort to break the Allied lines and win the war. The offensive was spearheaded by a new tactical doctrine, relying on elite, highly trained stormtroopers who bypassed strongpoints and caused chaos in the Allied rear.
But for the first time, Germany would also deploy its very own armored fighting vehicle. Shocked into action by the British success at Cambrai, German engineers had produced their answer to the British tank, the A7V Sturmpanzerwagen. It was, in every sense, a monster, a 30-ton, slab-sided steel box on tracks. It was operated by a crew of no fewer than 18 men. Its armament was formidable, a 57mm cannon mounted in the front, and 6 heavy machine guns bristling from its sides and rear. On paper, it was more heavily armed than any British tank, but the A7V was a deeply flawed machine, a perfect example of German over-engineering at the expense of practicality. It was clumsy, had a very high center of gravity that made it unstable on rough terrain, and its armor, while thick, was not hardened steel and prone to spalling. Most damningly, German industry, crippled by the Allied blockade, could only produce a minuscule number of them. In total, only 20 A7V tanks were ever built. While the Allies were beginning to think in terms of producing tanks by the thousand, the Germans could barely field a handful. The German High Command still saw the tank as a minor auxiliary weapon, a mobile pillbox to support infantry, not a war-winning weapon in its own right. On April 24, 1918, near the French village of Villers-Bretonneux, history was made. As the German spring offensive raged, a group of 3 German A7Vs lumbered across the morning mist, supporting an infantry attack. They were spotted by a patrol of 3 British Mark IV tanks. For the first time in history, armored fighting vehicles were about to engage each other in combat. The encounter began badly for the British. 2 of the Mark IVs were female tanks, armed only with machine guns. Their bullets rattled harmlessly off the thick hide of the lead A7V. The Nix, commanded by Lieutenant Wilhelm Biltz, the A7V returned fire with its powerful 57mm cannon and its machine guns, riddling the British female tanks, damaging them and forcing them to retreat. The German monster was triumphant. But the 3rd British tank was a pill, male, commanded by Lieutenant Frank Mitchell. It was armed with 2 6-pounder cannons. Mitchell, seeing his female consorts pulling back, ordered his driver to maneuver for a shot. Inside the rocking, deafening steel hull, his gunner desperately tried to get a clear aim at the moving German behemoth. He fired. The shell missed. The A7V fired back, its shells impacting around the Mark IV. Mitchell's gunner reloaded, aimed again, and fired. A direct hit. He fired again, another hit, and a third. The British 6-pounder shells, designed to penetrate fortifications, smashed into the A7V. Crippled, and with several crew members killed, Lieutenant Biltz's crew bailed out of their stricken vehicle. Lieutenant Mitchell's Mark IV had won the world's first tank versus tank battle. The age of armored warfare had truly begun. Despite this small victory, the German spring offensive made massive initial gains, smashing through the Allied lines, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Germans suffered over 1 million casualties they could not replace, and they had outrun their own supply lines. By summer, the offensive had ground to a halt, and now it was the Allies' turn. Reinforced by over 1 million fresh, eager American soldiers, and equipped with thousands of new and improved tanks, they were ready to deliver the final knockout blow. The beginning of the end for the German army came on August 8, 1918, at the Battle of Amiens. This was not another clumsy, experimental attack. This was the culmination of 2 years of painful learning, the first true, modern, combined arms battle. The assault was launched in complete secrecy and surprise. On a front of 14 miles, over 500 Allied tanks, mostly new, faster, more reliable British Mark V's advanced in a dense fog, accompanied by thousands of Canadian and Australian infantry, and supported by nearly 2,000 aircraft. The effect was not just a breakthrough, it was a complete and total collapse of the German front line. The tanks crushed machine gun nests and flattened barbed wire, allowing the elite infantry to pour through the gaps. Fighter planes strafed and bombed German positions, preventing reinforcements from moving up. In a single day, the Allies advanced up to 8 miles and took 12,000 German prisoners. But the most significant outcome was not measured in miles or prisoners, but in morale. For the first time in the war, entire German units, upon seeing the massed wave of Allied tanks, simply broke and ran. They threw down their weapons and surrendered without a fight. Their will to resist was finally irrevocably shattered. General Ludendorff, the stoic and ruthless leader of the German war effort, was shaken to his core by the reports from the front. He would later write in his memoirs, "August 8th was the black day of the German army in the history of this war. It put the decline of our fighting power beyond all doubt." The earlier skepticism was now a bitter memory, replaced by the stark admission of defeat from the highest authority in the German army. Amiens was the beginning of the General 100 Days Offensive, the final Allied push that would win the war. Throughout the autumn of 1918, the tank was the spearhead. Thousands of the light, nimble French Renault FT tanks, now available in massive numbers, proved devastatingly effective, swarming over German positions and supporting the infantry at every step. The heavy British Mark V tanks were used to smash through the main fortifications of the Hindenburg Line, the very defenses that had seemed so impregnable just a year before. The German army, starved, exhausted, and now psychologically broken by the terror of the tank, was in a state of constant retreat. The clumsy Landship of 1916 had evolved. It was no longer just a tool for crossing trenches. It had become the decisive weapon of mobile, offensive warfare, the key that had finally unlocked the bloody stalemate of the Western Front. The visionary dream of Winston Churchill and a handful of engineers had become a battle-winning reality, produced on an industrial scale they could have only dreamed of. The German generals, who had once been so skeptical, now had nothing left to do but advise their Kaiser that the war was lost. The Black Day of the German army, on August 8th, 1918, was not a singular event. It was the beginning of the end. Throughout the autumn, the Allied 100 Days Offensive became a relentless tide of steel. The British Mark V and V tanks, now more mechanically reliable, and the thousands of French Renault FTs swarming across the battlefield, became the iron spearhead that shattered the last vestiges of German resistance. The formidable Hindenburg Line, the defensive system that was supposed to bleed the Allies white, was systematically broken and overrun by coordinated tank and infantry assaults. For the common German soldier, the Panzerschreck, or tank terror, was now a constant, soul-crushing reality. Every rumble on the horizon, every unfamiliar engine noise, sent waves of panic through the trenches. Their will was broken. Carl Schmitt, if he survived to see these final months of the war, would have recognized that the world he knew, the world where brave infantry and machine guns ruled the battlefield, had died on that September morning in flares. The future belonged to steel. By early November, the German army was in a state of collapse. The Allied armies, spearheaded by an ever-growing fleet of tanks, were poised for a final invasion of Germany itself. The psychological impact of this reality, coupled with starvation on the home front and widespread mutiny, forced the German government to sue for peace. On November 11th, 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. The Great War was over. The tank, the clumsy, monstrous brainchild of a few determined visionaries, had fulfilled its ultimate purpose. It had broken the deadlock. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a strange amnesia seemed to settle over the victors. In Britain and France, many traditional military leaders, men from the old school of cavalry and infantry, dismissed the tank as a specialized one-trick pony. It was, in their view, a trench-crossing machine, a tool for the unique problem of the Western Front, now obsolete in an age of peace. Military budgets were slashed, the British Tank Corps was drastically reduced in size, and the revolutionary ideas about armored warfare were largely ignored. A few brilliant theorists, men like J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Little Hart saw the future with stunning clarity. They argued that the tank was not merely an infantry support weapon. They envisioned fast-moving, independent armies of tanks, armored divisions, that could strike deep into enemy territory, bypassing strongpoints to attack command centers and supply lines, winning wars with speed and shock. It was a revolutionary concept called mechanized warfare, but their prophetic voices were largely ignored in the halls of power in London and Paris. The French, in particular, made the catastrophic error of seeing the tank as a defensive tool designed to be parceled out in small groups to support their infantry, which was now hunkering down behind the new static defenses of the Maginot Line. They had learned nothing from the lesson of Cambrai. But there was one nation that was studying the lessons of the Great War's final year with a feverish, obsessive intensity: the defeated nation of Germany. Forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles from possessing tanks, aircraft, or heavy artillery, the new German Reichswehr turned to intellectual development. German military thinkers, under the leadership of men like General Hans von Seeckt, dissected every Allied victory of 1918. They were not interested in excuses. They wanted to understand the cold, hard mechanics of their own defeat. And at the heart of that defeat, they found the tank. They read the works of Fuller and Little Hart, not as interesting theories, but as a blueprint for the future. They studied how the Allies had finally learned to coordinate tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft into a single devastating force. Most importantly, they understood what the Allies themselves seemed to have forgotten, that the tank's true power lay not in supporting infantry assaults, but in creating breakthrough and exploiting it with speed. One German officer in particular, a communications specialist named Heinz Guderian, became the ultimate apostle of this new armored doctrine. He saw with perfect clarity what the British and French had failed to grasp, that the combination of the tank's firepower and mobility, when concentrated in independent formations and supported by aircraft, could become a weapon of unprecedented speed and destructive power. He envisioned a new kind of warfare, a Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The tank would not wait for the infantry. The tank would be the spearhead, the breakthrough weapon, and the exploitation force, all in one. Radio communication would allow entire armored divisions to coordinate their movements in real time, maintaining the speed and shock that would paralyze the enemy. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and cast off the shackles of the Treaty of Versailles, Guderian was given the green light to build his dream weapon, the Panzerwaffe. The irony was almost poetic. While the French were building slow, heavily armored tanks like the Char B1, designed for methodical infantry support, Guderian's Germany built fast median panzers like the Panzer III and IV, equipped with radios, and organized them into self-contained panzer divisions. Every detail was designed for speed, communication, and independent action. They trained relentlessly, perfecting the art of coordinating tanks, Stuka dive bombers acting as precision artillery, and motorized infantry into a seamless, unstoppable force. The students of armored warfare were about to give their former teachers a final, brutal lesson. The full circle of history closed in a matter of weeks in May and June of 1940. When Germany invaded France, the French army actually possessed more tanks than the Germans, approximately 3,000 French tanks against 2,400 German Panzers. Many of the French tanks, like the Char B1, were individually superior in armor and firepower to the German Panzers. On paper, the French should have won a tank battle, but doctrine, not hardware, decided the battle. The French doctrine was a relic of 1918, frozen in the mindset of the last war. Their tanks were scattered across the front in small but penny packets, attached to infantry divisions as support weapons. They were tethered to the slow pace of the foot soldier, designed to help infantry methodically push through fortified positions. French tank crews often lacked radios, communicating with flags and hand signals like ships of the Napoleonic era. They were individually powerful, but strategically blind and paralyzed. The German panzer divisions, by contrast, were concentrated into a single, massive armored fist, aimed at a single point. They did not attack the Maginot Line, the static fortification system the French had invested billions of francs into. They simply went around it, smashing through the impassable Ardennes forest in a shocking display of speed and coordination. Guderian's panzers, every tank equipped with a radio, raced across France like a steel flood, cutting off entire Allied armies. Their Stuka dive bombers acted as their flying artillery, destroying bridges and strongpoints with pinpoint accuracy. The French and British armies, with their superior but poorly organized and poorly coordinated tanks, were paralyzed. They could not react fast enough, could not communicate effectively, could not concentrate their forces where it mattered. Individual French tank units fought bravely and often won local engagements, but they were fighting yesterday's war. The Germans were fighting tomorrow's. France, which had held out for 4 years against Germany in the First World War, fell in 6 weeks. The legacy of the clumsy Landship of 1916 was now complete, and the irony was almost Shakespearean in its tragic perfection. The weapon invented by the British to break a static, defensive war had been perfected by the Germans to wage a dynamic, offensive one. The very doctrines that British visionaries like Fuller and Liddell Hart had proposed in the 1920s, the fast-moving, independent, armored divisions striding deep into enemy territory, had been largely ignored by their own country. Britain and France had won the First World War with the tank, but they had failed to learn its deeper lessons. They had mistaken the tank for a trench warfare tool, rather than understanding it as the key to a new kind of warfare entirely. Germany, the defeated nation, had been forced to learn. Forbidden from building weapons, they had built doctrine instead. They had studied their own defeat with ruthless objectivity, identified the tank as the decisive weapon, and then, when they were finally allowed to rearm, built an entire military philosophy around maximizing its potential. The dismissive attitude of 1916, when German staff officers had filed away intelligence reports about British armored tractors with skepticism, had transformed into a complete reversal. By 1940, Germany understood the tank better than its inventors did. The story of the tank's first appearance at the Somme and its evolution through to the fall of France is more than a tale of technological innovation. It is a profound lesson in the nature of military adaptation, institutional learning, and the danger of fighting the last war. The British and French, victorious in 1918, became complacent. They had solved the problem of trench warfare and assumed that solution was final. The Germans, defeated and humiliated, were forced to think harder, to learn faster, to innovate more desperately. Victory had bred conservatism. Defeat had bred revolution. From the muddy fields of the Somme, where Carl Schmitt first saw the iron monsters crawling toward his trench, to the Blitzkrieg across France, the tank carved its place as one of the defining weapons of the 20th century. France's, it was a weapon born of desperation, a mechanical answer to an impossible problem of flesh against steel. It broke the stalemate of the First World War, transforming from a clumsy experimental vehicle that broke down more often than it broke through into a reliable war winner. But its evolution did not stop in 1918. In the hands of Guderian and the German Panzerwaffe, it became the instrument of a new kind of warfare, fast, coordinated, and devastating. The tank story is a story of how a single, radical idea can change the very nature of human conflict. It is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional blindness, of how the victors of one war can become the victims of the next if they fail to keep learning and adapting. The earlier skepticism of German commanders toward British daylight, landships, the filed-away intelligence reports, the initial lack of urgency, these were not mere tactical errors. They were symptoms of a deeper failure of imagination, a failure to recognize that warfare itself was being fundamentally transformed. The Landship, once an object of doubt and derision, had not only crushed the trenches of the Somme, it had redrawn the map of modern warfare forever. The laughter, or at least the dismissive skepticism, of those German staff officers in 1916 had proven costly beyond measure. By 1918, they understood. By 1940, they had learned the lesson so well that they became the masters of the very weapon they had once underestimated. The age of armor had not just arrived, it had conquered.